September 15th, 1940, 8:30 in the morning. In a bunker 60 feet beneath the English countryside, a young woman wearing headphones stares at a glass screen. She is 19 years old. She has never fired a weapon. She has never seen combat. And in the next 12 hours, she will help direct one of the most important air battles in human history. On that screen, something is moving. A cluster of light, then another, then another. Hundreds of them, massing over the French coast, forming into waves. Above her, on a raised gallery, officers watch as the lights multiply. Nobody speaks. Everyone knows what this means. The Luftwaffe is coming. Not a raid, not a probe, everything. Hermann Göring has ordered the largest aerial assault of the war. Over 1,000 German aircraft are about to cross the English Channel. Bombers, fighters, wave after wave. The Reichsmarschall has promised Hitler that this day will break the Royal Air Force, that the skies over Britain will finally be empty, that the invasion can proceed. And the British have roughly 600 planes to stop them. The math is brutal. Germany has more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more factories. The Luftwaffe has conquered Poland in weeks, crushed France in 6, swept through the Low Countries like a scythe through wheat. Their pilots are veterans of Spain, of Poland, of the Western Front. Many have dozens of kills. They fly the Messerschmitt 109, fast, agile, deadly. They fly the Messerschmitt 110, the Junkers 88, the Heinkel 111. They have been told that victory is days away. Britain has been fighting alone for 3 months. The RAF is exhausted. Squadrons are down to half strength. Some pilots are flying 4, 5, 6 sorties a day. Replacement pilots are arriving with as little as 10 hours of flight training. Replacement aircraft are arriving slower than they are being destroyed. Ground crews have not slept properly in weeks. Airfields are cratered. Hangars are burned shells. On paper, this should be over within weeks. The German High Command believes it. The American ambassador has reported home that Britain cannot survive. Neutral observers are already writing obituaries for the British Empire. But there is something the Germans do not understand, something they have attacked, dismissed, and failed to grasp, something invisible. It sits in bunkers beneath the English hills. It hums in massive steel towers along the coast. It travels through telephone wires and crackles through headsets worn by women who have never seen a battlefield. And it is about to change everything. This is the story of Chain Home, the secret weapon that won the Battle of Britain. It was not a plane. It was not a bomb. It was not even a machine most people could see. It was a way of knowing. And the Nazis never figured out what they were really fighting. To understand what happened on September 15th, 1940, you have to go back 4 years, to a time when Britain was not yet at war, but a small group of men already knew it was coming, and they were terrified of what they saw. In 1934, the British government formed a committee to study air defense. The committee's findings were classified. They would have caused panic if released. The conclusion was stark. Britain had no effective defense against aerial attack. The problem was fundamental. Modern bombers, the kind Germany was building by the hundreds, could fly at speeds over 200 miles per hour. At altitudes above 15,000 feet, they could cross the Channel in minutes. Britain's detection system relied on human observers with binoculars. By the time they spotted incoming aircraft, reported by telephone, and the message reached Fighter Command, the bombers would already be over their targets. Fighters took 15 minutes to scramble, climb to altitude, and form up. In that time, London could burn. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, told Parliament the truth that haunted military planners across Europe. The bomber will always get through. It was not defeatism. It was mathematics. Air raid drills assumed tens of thousands of casualties in the first week of any war. Hospitals prepared for gas attacks. The government stockpiled cardboard coffins. Civil defense planners grimly calculated how quickly crematoriums could process the dead. Against this despair, one man proposed something different. His name was Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist working at the National Physical Laboratory, 42 years old, descended from James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, reserved, methodical, the kind of man who solved problems by refusing to accept they were unsolvable. In January 1935, the Air Ministry asked Watson Watt a peculiar question. Could radio waves destroy aircraft? A death ray, essentially. Watson Watt's assistant, Arnold Wilkins, ran the calculations. Radio waves could not deliver enough energy to harm an aircraft. But Wilkins noticed something else. Radio waves bounced off metal objects. If you transmitted a powerful signal and listened for the echo, you could find aircraft at distances far beyond human vision. Watson Watt grasped the implications immediately. On February 12, 1935, he sent a memo to the Air Ministry. Detection and location of aircraft by radio methods. It would become one of the most important documents in British military history. Weeks later, Watson Watt conducted a demonstration that would alter the course of the war. Using a BBC shortwave radio transmitter at Daventry and a simple receiver mounted in a van, his team attempted to detect a Royal Air Force Hayford bomber flying overhead. The day was February 26, 1935. Cold, clear, perfect conditions. The bomber flew a pre-planned route, passing the BBC transmitter at 6,000 feet. In the van, Watson Watt and Wilkins watched an oscilloscope screen. A blip appeared, faint but unmistakable. The bomber was 8 miles away. The test lasted less than an hour. The equipment was crude, borrowed parts, improvised antennas, laboratory prototypes. But the principle was proven. Radio waves could find aircraft before human eyes could see them. They could give warning. They could give time. And time, in 1940, would be the only thing standing between Britain and annihilation. The Air Ministry immediately grasped what Watson Watt had given them. Within weeks, funding was approved. A research station was established at Orfordness, on the Suffolk coast, later moving to Bawdsey Manor. The project was classified at the highest level. By June 1935, the team could detect aircraft at 17 miles. By September, 40 miles. By March 1936, 75 miles. But Watson Watt understood that detection alone was not enough. The information had to reach the fighters in time to matter. This was not a scientific problem. It was a systems problem. And solving it would require a different kind of mind. Within months, the British government approved one of the most ambitious defense projects in history. Not a fleet of bombers. Not a new fighter. A chain of radio detection stations stretching along the entire eastern and southern coast of England. They called it Chain Home. The construction was massive, secret, urgent. Workers who did not know what they were building erected enormous steel towers in fields across Kent, Sussex, Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk. Transmitter towers rose to 360 feet. Receiver towers reached 240 feet. They dominated the landscape. But civilians were told they were for naval communications, experimental antennas, nothing more. By the summer of 1939, 21 stations were operational, from the Shetland Islands in the north to the Isle of Wight in the south. Each station transmitted powerful pulses of radio energy out over the channel. Each pulse traveled at the speed of light. When it hit metal, the skin of an aircraft, it bounced back. The returning echo was so faint, it required extraordinary sensitivity to detect. The timing of that echo, the delay between transmission and return, revealed distance. The angle revealed direction. With experience and skill, operators could estimate altitude, speed, and even the size of the formation. Chain Home could detect aircraft at distances of up to 120 miles. On a good day, with good conditions, it could spot bombers massing over France before they even crossed the coast. It was the world's first integrated radar network. But the towers were only part of the system. Radar gave you information. It did not tell you what to do with it. The real genius, the part that would actually win the battle, was what happened after the radar picked up a signal. Every detection was immediately relayed by telephone to a central operations room. There, plotters, mostly young women recruited from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, received the reports and placed wooden markers on a giant map table. Each marker represented a detected formation. Red for hostile, blue for friendly. Each marker included altitude, heading, and estimated strength. The plotting room was a machine made of people. Telephone operators receiving calls, plotters updating positions every few minutes, supervisors checking for errors, a tote board showing the status of every squadron, available, airborne, refueling, under repair. Above the map table, on a raised gallery, sat the controllers. They watched the picture develop in real time. They could see the enemy forming over France. They could see their own fighters on the ground. They could calculate interception points. They could decide when to scramble, which squadrons to launch, where to send them. This was not just radar. This was something entirely new in human warfare. A system that turned raw information into coordinated action. It had a name. The Dowding System, after the man who built it. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was not a popular figure. He was 58 years old in 1940, tall, thin, gray. His face was carved with lines that suggested decades of bureaucratic battles fought and often lost. His colleagues called him Stuffy, and they did not mean it affectionately. Dowding was cold, rigid, blunt to the point of rudeness. He did not suffer fools. He did not play political games. He clashed with Churchill. He clashed with the Air Ministry. He clashed with the commanders who wanted to use fighter squadrons for offensive operations rather than defense. When France fell in June 1940, the War Cabinet demanded that Dowding send more fighters across the Channel. The French were begging for support. Churchill himself pushed for it. Dowding refused. He appeared before the cabinet with a single piece of paper, a graph showing fighter losses versus production. The lines crossed. Below a certain number of squadrons, he explained, Britain could not defend itself. If he sent more fighters to France, there would not be enough left to protect Britain when France fell. He was right. France surrendered 3 weeks later. The fighters Dowding had saved became the core of the force that would fight the Battle of Britain. But Dowding understood something his critics did not, something deeper than aircraft numbers. The Battle of Britain would not be won by heroism alone. It would not be won by throwing brave men against overwhelming odds and hoping for the best. It would be won by efficiency, by making every fighter count, by never wasting a sortie, by knowing where the enemy was before they arrived, by calculating interception points with mathematical precision, by treating air defense not as a series of individual combats, but as a single integrated system. Without radar, British fighters would have to fly constant patrols, burning fuel, exhausting pilots, wearing out engines, waiting for an enemy they might never see. With radar, they could stay on the ground until the last moment, engines off, pilots resting, then launch directly at the incoming threat. They could climb to the perfect altitude. They could position for an advantageous attack. 10 fighters used efficiently could do the work of 40 used blindly. This was Dowding's vision, not more planes, better use of the planes he had. He had spent years building this system, fighting for funding, demanding that the stations be built, the telephone lines be laid, the operations rooms be constructed. He had personally supervised exercises, worked out procedures, trained controllers. Now, with the Luftwaffe massing across the Channel, that system was about to be tested. And everything, the fate of Britain, the outcome of the war, perhaps the future of civilization itself, depended on whether it would work. July 1940. The Luftwaffe begins its campaign against Britain. The opening phase is cautious. German bombers probe the English Channel, attacking convoys, testing defenses. The RAF responds cautiously. Dowding refuses to commit his strength to defending ships. Convoys are expendable. Fighters are not. But even in these early skirmishes, the Germans notice something strange. British fighters appear quickly, too quickly. Interceptions happen with unnerving precision. A formation of Junkers 88s crosses the coast at dawn, expecting to strike unopposed. Hurricanes are waiting for them at 15,000 feet. A flight of Messerschmitts sweeps inland, expecting to catch RAF squadrons on the ground. They find Spitfires already climbing to meet them. Luftwaffe intelligence officers scratch their heads. How are the British doing this? They compile reports. They interview pilots. They study the timing. By any calculation, the RAF should not be able to respond so fast. Fighters take time to scramble. They take time to receive orders. They take time to climb. The British are breaking the laws of physics. The answer should have been obvious. The massive towers along the coast were not camouflaged. Some were over 300 feet high. They could be seen from miles away, clearly visible to any reconnaissance aircraft flying over the channel. German reconnaissance aircraft did photograph them. Excellent photographs. Clear images of transmitter arrays, receiver stations, power supplies, access roads. German signals intelligence detected the transmissions. German scientists, some of the best in the world, analyzed the frequencies. And the Germans concluded, correctly, that these were radar stations. They called them Freya stations, after a similar German system. So far, so good. The Germans knew what they were looking at. But then, they made a critical mistake. One of the most consequential intelligence failures of the Second World War. On August 12, 1940, the day before what the Luftwaffe called Adlertag, Eagle Day, the planned start of the final air offensive, German bombers launched a coordinated attack on the radar stations. Stukas screamed down on Ventnor, on the Isle of Wight. Bombs smashed through buildings. The antenna array was damaged. The station went off the air. Junkers 88s hit Dover, Rye, Dunkirk, and Pevensey. More damage, more casualties. At Pevensey, bombs struck the operations building directly. Windows shattered. Equipment was thrown across the room. WAAF personnel dove for cover, with explosions hammering the walls around them. For several hours, there was a gap in the chain, a blind spot in Britain's vision. And then, nothing. The follow-up never came. The Luftwaffe did not systematically destroy the remaining stations. They bombed them once, assessed the damage, and turned their attention elsewhere. Why? Because Luftwaffe intelligence concluded that the radar stations were not important enough to warrant sustained attack. The reasoning was logical and completely wrong. German commanders observed that British fighters continued to intercept raids even after the attacks on radar. Ventnor was off the air, but pilots still found the bombers. Therefore, they reasoned, the British must be using some other method to detect aircraft, perhaps a vast network of underground observers, perhaps signals intelligence, perhaps spies in occupied France reporting when bombers took off. Whatever it was, the radar stations clearly were not essential. They were secondary systems, perhaps even decoys. The Luftwaffe turned its attention to more obvious targets: airfields, factories, ports. It was one of the worst intelligence failures of the war. What the Germans did not understand, what they never understood, was that the doubting system was designed for exactly this kind of resilience. The stations were repaired quickly. At Ventnor, engineers worked through the night. Mobile radar units were rushed to fill the gap. Within hours, a backup transmitter was operational. The chain was restored before the Germans even realized it had been broken. More importantly, the Observer Corps, trained watchers stationed across southern England, provided backup tracking. Once enemy aircraft crossed the coast, human eyes took over. The system was not a single point of failure. It was layers of redundancy. But the Germans never grasped the larger truth. the truth that would have changed everything if they had understood it. Radar was not just a detection device. It was the foundation of an entire command and control architecture. The Germans knew about radar. They had radar themselves, in some ways more sophisticated than chain home, but they used it tactically. Individual stations detecting individual threats. Information passed upward through slow bureaucratic channels. They did not conceive of radar as the nervous system of an integrated defense network. They did not imagine operations rooms where dozens of people worked in concert, updating a shared picture of the battle every few seconds. They did not understand that the towers along the coast were just the eyes, and that behind those eyes was a brain that could direct hundreds of fighters with centralized precision. They saw, and meanwhile, far beneath the ground, young women in headphones moved markers across maps. Controllers studied the picture and made decisions. Squadrons received orders within minutes of detection. The Germans, they were fighting a system, and they had no idea the system existed. By late, the Luftwaffe shifted strategy. The radar stations proved too difficult to destroy permanently. Convoys could scatter and hide. So Göring ordered his bombers to attack the true center of British air power, the RAF airfields themselves. Hangars collapsed, runways cratered, communications lines severed. At Biggin Hill, a direct hit on a shelter killed 39 ground personnel in a single explosion. The operations room was destroyed. The station commander reported that one more heavy raid would make the airfield unusable. And the squadron. There was a pilot, and for the not because doubting. Now the losses, doubting the math, and then a group, the bomb. It was. Churchill did not wait for explanations. Within hours, he ordered Bomber Command to retaliate. On August 25th, British bombers struck Berlin. The material damage was minimal. The psychological impact was enormous. Hitler was enraged. The Führer had publicly promised that enemy bombs would never fall on the German capital. He had mocked the RAF, and now Berlin was burning, however slightly. On September 4th, Hitler appeared before a roaring crowd at the Berlin Sportpalast. His voice rose to a scream. If the British Air Force drops 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 kilograms of bombs, then we will drop 150,000, 200,000, 300,000 or more. He ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks from RAF airfields to London itself. The Blitz was about to begin. For civilians, this was catastrophe. Thousands would die. But from a military perspective, Hitler had made a catastrophic error. The bombing of London was devastating, but it was not decisive. British morale did not collapse. War production continued in factories outside the capital. And the airfields received a reprieve. Cratered runways were repaired. Damaged aircraft were patched. Dispersal huts, blasted to splinters, were replaced. Communications lines, cut and spliced a dozen times, became functional again. Most importantly, the pilots received something they had not had in weeks: rest. Not much. A day, 2 days, enough for exhausted men to sleep, to eat, to stop shaking. It was enough. And the radar network, never seriously attacked again after August 12th, continued to function. The German bombers now flew toward London, following the Thames. Radar tracked them from the moment they formed up over France. The Dowding system guided fighters to intercept before they reached the capital. The crisis had passed. The RAF had survived. But Göring still believed victory was close, and he was about to launch one final, massive assault. On September 15th, 1940, everything came together. Göring ordered a massive daylight assault on London. This would be the knockout blow. The Reichsmarshal had promised it for weeks. He had told Hitler that the RAF was down to its last 50 Spitfires, that fighter command was finished, that one more push would shatter British resistance and clear the way for invasion. Over 1,000 aircraft would participate. Dornier bombers in tight formations, Heinkel 111s loaded with incendiaries, Messerschmitt 109s as close escort, Messerschmitt 110s as heavy fighters, wave after wave in the largest coordinated air assault since the campaign began. In the bunker at Uxbridge, No. 11 Group Headquarters, the plotting room watched them form. Winston Churchill had arrived that morning, accompanied by his wife. He wanted to see the system work. At 9 o'clock, the first contacts appeared. Radar operators at Rye and Dover reported aircraft massing over the Pas de Calais. 200 plus, 300 plus, still climbing. In the plotting room, women received coordinates through headsets. Their hands moved in practiced patterns, placing markers on the map. Red for hostile, numbers indicating altitude, arrows indicating direction. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group, watched from the gallery. Park was Dowding's operational lieutenant, the man who actually directed the fighting. He was 50 years old, a veteran of the First World War, lean and intense. Park studied the picture. He calculated. Then he began issuing orders. He did not scramble everything at once. That was the instinct. Throw everything into the sky, meet the enemy with maximum force. But that would exhaust his squadrons in a single engagement. The Germans would send more waves. There had to be reserves. Instead, Park scrambled squadrons in sequence, timed to hit the incoming waves at maximum effectiveness, careful not to commit too early while bombers were still over the channel, careful not to commit too late and allow bombing runs to proceed unopposed. This was the Dowding system at its peak. 20 radar stations feeding data to the filter room at Fighter Command Headquarters, the filter room processing it, eliminating duplicates, establishing tracks. Filtered information flowing down to Group Headquarters at Uxbridge. Keith Park making decisions. Squadron commanders receiving orders within minutes of detection. 20 young women moving markers across a map. Officers talking quietly into telephones, and hundreds of young men climbing into cockpits across southern England. At 11 o'clock, the first German wave crossed the English coast. They were met by fighters, not scattered patrols, hunting blindly across empty sky. Massed formations, hurricanes climbing to interception altitude, Spitfires positioning for slashing attacks on the escorts, flights vectored to precise coordinates by controllers who could see the battle unfolding in real time below them. Squadron leader Douglas Bader led a wing of 5 squadrons from the Duxford sector, 60 fighters in tight formation. They hit the bombers head-on at 25,000 feet. German crews, told the RAF was finished, saw the sky fill with British fighters. Over Kent, over Surrey, over the Thames estuary, the air became a battlefield. The fighting was savage. Dornier bombers fell out of formation, engines streaming smoke and flame. Messerschmitts dove and climbed, trying to protect their charges. British fighters pressed their attacks, firing until their ammunition drums were empty, then turning for home to rearm. Parachutes dotted the sky, German and British alike. Aircraft spiraled down, trailing fire. Wreckage scattered across fields and villages. But the bomber formations could not hold. Without close escort, the Messerschmitt 109s were hampered by limited fuel, forced to turn back over the coast. The bombers were vulnerable, and the British fighters knew exactly where they were. By noon, the first wave had been broken. Bombers scattered. Some reached London. Some dropped their loads early and ran for home. Others never made it back across the Channel. In the bunker at Uxbridge, the plotters cleared the markers from the board. Then did it all again. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, radar picked up fresh formations massing over France. Churchill was still watching. He turned to Park and asked a single question. "What reserves do we have?" Park looked at the board. Every squadron was marked as airborne or refueling. "There are none," he said. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Churchill later wrote that he understood, in that silence, how close they were to the edge. One more wave, without reserves to meet it, could be catastrophic. But Dowding had planned for this. The system was designed for exactly this kind of crisis. Squadrons that had landed were being refueled and rearmed at frantic speed. Ground crews worked with desperate efficiency, engines running, pilots in cockpits, ammunition being loaded. Within 15 minutes of landing, aircraft were taking off again. Pilots who had flown the morning mission climbed back into fighters and launched toward the second wave. Men who had been in combat 2 hours earlier went back up, exhausted, running on adrenaline and tea. The second wave was met, not with fresh reserves, there were none, with exhausted men flying on determination. And the Luftwaffe, expecting the RAF to have collapsed, found the sky full of Spitfires. The psychological effect was devastating. German pilots had been told fighter command was broken, and yet here they were, hundreds of them, clawing at the bomber formations. By 4 o'clock, the second wave had shattered. By evening, the battle was over. The Germans had launched the largest air assault of the campaign. They had thrown everything they had at British defenses. Goering had promised total victory. And they had failed. Luftwaffe losses that day. 60 aircraft confirmed destroyed. Dozens more damaged beyond repair. Pilots killed, captured, or missing. Over 100. RAF losses. 26 aircraft. 13 pilots killed. The kill ratio was better than 2-to-1. On the day meant to break Fighter Command had delivered its most crushing defeat. The numbers told only part of the story. The psychological impact was shattering. German bomber crews returned to their bases, shaken. They had been told for weeks that the RAF was finished. Intelligence reports said fewer than 100 fighters remained operational. And yet the sky had been full of them. Hurricanes and Spitfires attacking from every direction, in numbers that seemed impossible. Morale cracked. Some crews began refusing to fly. Commanding officers noted the confidence of early summer had vanished. On September 17th, Hitler met with his senior commanders. The Luftwaffe had promised air superiority. It had not delivered. Hitler made the decision that Churchill had been praying for. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, was postponed indefinitely. The invasion barges, massed in French and Belgian ports, were dispersed. The assault troops, trained for beach landings, were redeployed. The elaborate deception operations, the intelligence preparations, the naval plans, all swept aside. Britain would not be invaded. The Battle of Britain was won. It was won, ultimately, not by aircraft, but by information. Not by courage alone, though courage was essential, but by a system that multiplied the effect of every courageous act. Chain Home had done what it was designed to do, not by destroying aircraft, by giving commanders knowledge, by buying time, by ensuring that outnumbered pilots fought efficiently instead of blindly. The Germans had more planes. Britain had better knowledge. Knowledge won. In the years after the war, historians debated what had truly saved Britain. Some credited the pilots, the few, as Churchill called them, and their courage was real. Young men, barely trained, flying into formations of bombers and fighters, dying at rates that would have emptied every squadron. Some credited the aircraft. The Spitfire became a symbol of British defiance. Beautiful, fast, deadly, its elliptical wings became an icon, reproduced on countless posters and monuments. Some credited Churchill's speeches, British morale, the spirit of the Blitz, the refusal of civilians to surrender even as their cities burned. All of these mattered. None of them alone would have been enough. The men who had fought the battle knew the deeper truth. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who had commanded the fighter squadrons in the southeast, who had made the decisions in that bunker at Uxbridge, said it plainly after the war. Without radar, the battle would have been lost. Not in months, in weeks, perhaps days. Without Chain Home, the RAF would have been forced to fly constant standing patrols, aircraft circling endlessly over southern England, burning fuel, exhausting pilots, wearing out engines. Even with maximum effort, they could not have covered every approach. The Luftwaffe would have found the gaps, would have struck airfields without warning, would have achieved surprise again and again. And surprise in aerial combat is almost everything. The Germans could have ground down the RAF through simple attrition. Numerical superiority would have done its slow, grinding work. Without time to identify incoming raids, to calculate interception points, to concentrate force, Britain would have bled out faster than it could regenerate. Radar changed the equation. It let the British fight smart. It let them husband their resources. It let them concentrate force at the decisive point. It turned a disadvantage in numbers into an advantage in efficiency. It turned an impossible defense into a possible one. And the Germans never adapted. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. The failure was not technological. German scientists understood radar perfectly well. In some respects, German radar was more advanced than chain home, using shorter wavelengths, capable of greater precision. Germany had deployed radar on ships, on night fighters, on the Atlantic Wall later in the war. German engineers were brilliant. But German doctrine never grasped what the British had created. The Luftwaffe was built for offense, for blitzkrieg, fast, overwhelming strikes that shattered enemy forces before they could organize. It was not a doctrine that thought carefully about defense, about integration, about systems. When German commanders looked at chain home, they saw radar stations, individual pieces of hardware. They attacked them as individual targets. Knock one out, move to the next. They never understood that the stations were not the weapon. The weapon was the system that connected them. They looked at the fingers and missed the brain. Britain, desperate and outmatched, had been forced to innovate, to build something unprecedented. Germany, confident in its strength, had not. By the time they might have understood, the war had moved on. Russia, the Atlantic, the Pacific, radar became universal, but the principle remained. After the war, the radar stations were quietly dismantled. The massive towers came down, one by one. Steel was salvaged, equipment was stripped, the bunkers were sealed, their entrances hidden beneath new construction. The WAAF plotters went home. Women who had held the fate of nations in their hands returned to civilian life. The work was still classified. Who would believe that history had been altered by girls in headphones, moving markers across a map? Hugh Dowding did not live to see how completely his vision would reshape modern warfare. In November 1940, just weeks after the battle was won, he was removed from his command, forcibly retired, pushed out by rivals who resented his cold manner, his bureaucratic victories, his refusal to play political games. The Air Ministry had never liked him. He had fought them for years over resources, over strategy, over doctrine. He had been right, repeatedly, and they had not forgiven him for it. Churchill, who had clashed with Dowding so often, who had demanded fighters for France that Dowding refused to send, wrote later that Dowding had been right about nearly everything, that his stubbornness had saved the country, that history owed him a debt it could never repay. But history is not generous with its heroes. Dowding received a barony. He lived quietly until 1970, largely forgotten. The pilots got the glory. The system that made their victory possible was rarely mentioned. Keith Park, the operational commander who had directed the fighting from Uxbridge, fared little better. He was transferred to a training command, a demotion disguised as reassignment. He spent years in obscure postings, while others received credit for battles he had won. Only decades later, when historians examined the records, did the full picture emerge. Both men are now regarded as among the most critical figures of the war. But in 1940, they were simply pushed aside. Robert Watson Watt, the physicist who had made radar work, was knighted. He never became famous. He never sought the spotlight. He spent his later years in relative obscurity, occasionally giving lectures, occasionally writing about the early days. Once, pulled over for speeding by a policeman using a radar gun, Watson Watt reportedly remarked, "If I had known what they were going to do with it, I would never have invented it." He understood that his invention had saved his country, but he also understood that invention alone was not enough. It had taken thousands of people to turn a scientific principle into a weapon. And the principle that system established would reshape warfare for the next century. Every modern air defense network descends from Chain-Home. Every integrated command and control system traces its lineage to the plotting rooms under Uxbridge and Bentley Priory. Every satellite link, every drone control station, every network-centric battlefield. All of it began with women in headphones, moving markers across a map while bombs fell overhead. The data-driven warfare of the 21st century was born in the summer of 1940. Modern military theorists call it information dominance. Know what the enemy is doing before they know you know. Make decisions faster than the adversary can react. Turn knowledge into coordinated action. The American military, rebuilding after Pearl Harbor, studied the British system intensively. AWACS aircraft, the Aegis combat system. The entire architecture of American air defense was influenced by what Dowding and Watson Watt created. The principle scales. It applies to naval combat, to ground maneuver, to cyber warfare. Know more. Decide faster. Coordinate better. The side that sees clearly will defeat the side that fights blind. This is Chain-Home's true legacy, not the towers, not the radar sets. The idea that information is a weapon. On clear days, you can still fly over the English Channel and see the white cliffs of Dover rising from the sea. The same cliffs the Luftwaffe crossed in 1940. The same cliffs that British pilots defended with their lives. Somewhere below those cliffs, buried in the chalk, are the remains of old bunkers, plotting rooms, operations centers, the places where the battle was truly won. At Bawdsey Manor, where Watson Watt's team first proved radar could work, there is now a museum. Visitors can walk the halls where engineers worked through the night, stand on the cliffs and look out across the water that German bombers once crossed. At the RAF Museum in London, a reconstructed operations room shows how the system worked. The clock shows a moment in September 1940, a moment when everything hung in the balance. The Spitfire is remembered, as it should be. Beautiful machines. Brave men. The image that captured the imagination of a nation under siege. But the women with headphones, the men with telephones, the scientists with equations, the commanders with maps. They deserve to be remembered too. They did not fly through fire. They did not engage the enemy in single combat. They worked in bunkers, in plotting rooms, in research stations. They built something new. They built the invisible weapon. And it saved everything. If this story of the hidden weapon that changed history stayed with you, consider subscribing. This channel exists to tell the stories that time has tried to bury. The overlooked decisions, the forgotten innovations, the ordinary people who shaped the world when no one was looking. There are more stories like this one, waiting to be told.